Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar from the Business and Human Rights Journal, Beyond Human Rights Due Diligence, What Else Do We Need? I'm Abby Fiddes and I'm from Cambridge University Press. And before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You've all joined in listen-only mode. However, you will have the opportunity to submit questions by typing into the Q&A box. You may send in your questions at any time during the discussion and they will be addressed during the Q&A session at the end of today's webinar. Should you experience any technical difficulties, please add this to the Q&A box and a member of the organising team will endeavour to help you. In the unlikely event we experience any major technical issues, we will message the audience and restart the webinar. The whole event will take about 1 hour. To get everything started, I'm delighted to turn things over to Surya Deva, who will now introduce the panelists.
Thank you, Abby. Hello, everyone. My name is Surya Dev. I'm a professor at the Macquarie Law School and one of the editors-in-chief of the Business and Human Rights Journal. At the outset, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Kamaral people of the Darug Nation, whose culture and traditions have nurtured this land from where I'm joining. And I would also like to pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. So it gives me a great pleasure to moderate this webinar, which is entitled Beyond Human Rights Due Diligence, What Else Do We Need? I think it will be fair to say that in a short span of time of 12 years or so, human rights due diligence, or HRDD, has become a concept which is widely known and widely used in the business and human rights field. Although we can trace the roots of this concept to UN norms at least, and under international human rights law as well, it is the UN guiding principles and late Professor Ruggie who created and crafted this particular concept, and it has proved to be highly influential. So this special issue critically analyzes both the normative concept, the idea of the human rights due diligence, its limitations, and what else do we need. We have an excellent panelist, and before I invite the panelists to introduce themselves, let me briefly mention the format of this webinar. So I would like to make it more like an interactive dialogue. And with this in mind, I'm going to ask a question to each of the 5 panelists to begin with in the first round. And then I'm going to take questions that you post in the Q&A. So I will very much appreciate if you can start putting those questions, and I'm going to take those. And then hopefully there'll be some provocation amongst the panelists as well for some dialogue. So with this in mind, why don't I invite David first to briefly introduce himself.
Great, thank you very much. And thanks again so much for the invitation to come speak today. My name is David Karp. I'm a senior lecturer in international relations at the University of Sussex, and also the author of the book Responsibility for Human Rights, Transnational Corporations in Imperfect States. I'm joining you from Brighton, UK today, where it's a beautiful day for a change, and I can't wait to engage in this discussion. Thanks again.
Thank you, David, and welcome. I will invite now Julia.
Hello, I'm also really delighted to be here. My name's Julia Dem. I'm a senior lecturer in the law school at La Trobe University in Melbourne, Australia, and my research focuses on international and domestic climate and environment law, natural resource governance, questions of human rights, economic inequality, and social justice. I'm speaking to you today from Naarm, Melbourne, to the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and I also want to pay my respects to their elders, past and present.
Thank you, Julia. Juan Pablo.
Good morning. Thank you, Surya. I'm currently senior researcher at the Argentina's Scientific Research Council, and until 2020, I was a UN independent expert on debt and human rights.
Thank you, Juan Pablo, and thank you for joining so early. Barnali.
Hi, I'm Barnelli Chaudhary. I'm a professor of law at Osgoode Hall Law School in Canada and currently a visiting professor at the National University of Singapore, which is where I am calling in from today. The weather is not as nice as it is in Brighton. It's actually raining here, but we are actually enjoying it because it's about 400 degrees here. In any case, my research really focuses on business and human rights issues, but I guess take a little bit different perspective than perhaps some of our other colleagues here. I'm also a corporate law professor, so that's sort of the angle that I'm going to focus on today. And I am absolutely delighted to be here. So thank you so much, Surya, for having me.
Thank you, Barnelli. It's a pleasure. Last but not least, Mariana.
Thank you, Surya, and hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Mariana Leite. I'm the Global Advocacy and Development Policy Manager at a network called ACT Alliance. I'm also the co-editor of an upcoming book called Writing the Economy, which delves into some of the issues that I touch upon in the article that I'll present today. I'm joining from Belgium, from Brussels to be exact, but I'm originally from Brazil. And I'm a little bit envious of David because here is always raining. So it would be very unlikely that I would say it's a beautiful day, but I'm very happy to be here with all of you.
Thank you, everyone. So I'm joining from Sydney, very cold Sydney. All right. So David, if I may start with you, in your article, which I found very thought-provoking, you kind of challenge the normative foundations of the UN guiding principles, or the division between Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, the duty of a state to protect against human rights abuses and the corporate responsibility aspect. And you articulate this idea of a missing fourth pillar. Earlier scholars have also argued about a missing fourth pillar, but that was about that civil society is missing. But I think your missing fourth pillar is slightly different from that articulation. So can you please explain what your main critique is and what is this missing fourth pillar in your view? Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for the questions. So let me start by saying that I think I'm right about this. I think I'm the only contributor to the special issue to manage to avoid putting the words human rights due diligence, or the due diligence anyway, in the title of my article. I call this by a different name. I call it the ethics of disembedded liberalism. And the concepts of embedded and disembedded are taken from John Ruggie's early work as an international relations scholar in the early 1980s, who himself explicitly draws the term from Polanyi's book, The Great Transformation. In the paper, I draw on Jessica White and Wendy Brown's work to define neoliberalism as the active reconfiguration of state policy and international order, which accelerated in the early 1980s. To facilitate deregulated and borderless global economic competition between private market actors. And the key point that I try to bring out is that those neoliberal policies are grounded by their proponents in a certain conception of human nature as homo economicus, the rationally calculating individual who weighs up costs and benefits, who should be left free to value whatever he wishes, and I use the gendered pronoun intentionally, as long as his actions do not cause harm to others. Neoliberal world order furthermore constitutes businesses as private actors in that same sense as individuals. Businesses too are seen as having boundless freedom to pursue whatever values and or ends they choose, subject to the limit that they're not allowed to cause harm to other individuals' rights and freedoms in the process of pursuing their own freedom. On the other hand, states in the UN guiding principles are public. Their job is to enforce the rules that apply to those actors that have been constituted as private, and especially in terms of private actors' ability to pursue their own rights and freedoms. The point that I make is that the way that the UNGPs structurally separate the state duty to protect, falling on public actors, from the corporate responsibility to respect, falling on private actors, with businesses, as the private actors in that framework, that reifies rather than challenges neoliberalism's public-private divides and neoliberalism's divide between the political and the economic fields. And I suppose that, to answer one of your questions directly, Surya, is one of the things that Ruggie gets wrong. Ruggie thinks that this is a transformation of neoliberalism because liberalism, which had been disembedded in the 80s, is getting re-embedded globally in an authoritative global framework. And I disagree. I think that these public-private political economic distinctions are entirely reflective of, not only reflective of, but they further entrench a neoliberal world order. So then in the paper, I talk about harm. One of the problems of the idea of harm at the foundation of human rights due diligence is that harm is an essentially contested concept. The success of human rights due diligence as a concept relies on critical engagement with the question of what counts as harm, what counts as a human rights impact, and why. And I think this has been under-noticed to an extent in the literature, although there are some exceptions. Fasterling's work, for example, has also discussed this in a different way. Let me give some examples. The climate emergency, systemic racism, and other forms of structural injustice are all now emphasized in human rights practice as significant forms of harm. However, these would have been invisible to companies engaged in human rights due diligence not very long ago, because they weren't emphasized up until very recently as forms of harm that we're interested in as human rights practitioners and scholars. And there is still ongoing political disagreement, for the better or the worse, about whether these things are in fact harmful to human rights or whether they count as human rights violations instead of as something else. There are some forms of economic activity, I say in the paper, that arguably should not be engaged in at all for human rights reasons. For example, selling tobacco, mining coal, marketing skin bleaching cosmetic products, or manufacturing cluster munitions. And I say that when one is asking about the human rights impact of producing skin bleaching cosmetic products, for example, is it harmful, is the wrong question. It doesn't take one's attention in the right direction, because the answer to that question changes depending on how visible racism and colorism are as forms of discrimination to the actors engaging in the due diligence. Actors that have already been constituted as private, as having the right to a private self that sets and pursues its own values within the boundaries of the law, may be incapable of seeing or accepting when it's not simply their choices, but their very existence, their core economic activity that is detrimental to human rights. One of the solutions to this that I propose in the paper is I say that the positive value of equality rather than the negative value of harm better captures what companies should be looking for when they do human rights due diligence. I draw from Anne Phillips to argue that equality is a relational concept focused on differentials in power and capability across individuals and groups who should otherwise be social and political equals. Companies who do human rights due diligence, if they really want to be respecting human rights, need to consider the ways in which their strategy and operations may contribute to human inequality, not only the ways in which they may be contributing to harm. Final point that I'll make is about the missing fourth pillar that you mentioned, Surya, in your question. And the way that I talk about this, the way that I define this is starts off by saying that businesses do not necessarily fall on the private side of a public-private divide. And this provides additional reasons for not accepting the idea that their responsibility for human rights is limited to harm. I draw from Iris Marion Young's work to argue that businesses are not only moral agents who need to consider their own responsibilities, but what businesses are is they also coordinate production and they enable transnational social connections. They are therefore not only moral agents, but in their own right, they are that, but they're also therefore a part of the structural fabric of neoliberalism. As I've argued in the earlier section, as I had argued earlier in the earlier sections of the paper, actors and spaces have been demarcated in today's world as public or private in a way that disrupts the social guarantee of human rights. Neoliberal world order constitutes businesses as private, as free to do what they wish, free to value what they wish, subject to doing no harm. And I say that this needs to be challenged, but not only by businesses and by states. The missing fourth pillar is a collective and political responsibility which falls on all of us, on all individuals and groups, to challenge and to change and to critically consider the institutional order in which actors and spaces have been demarcated as public and private in this way. And there's so much more to say, but I think I've used my time. So I will end there and look forward to the questions.
Thank you very much, David. This public-private divide has been a hotly debated issue, and feminist scholars have also articulated that this divide is problematic. And I think you add another dimension to that debate. So that's very welcome, I believe. So all the participants who are joining this webinar, once again, I will invite you to post your questions, comments in Q&A function. So then I'm going to pick up those questions. So you can pose questions to specific panelists, or you can pose questions generally that I can pick up from there. Now, Julia, if I can come to you now. In your paper, you critique this concept of climate due diligence. Now, everyone is almost celebrating due diligence, human rights due diligence, and now this mandatory human rights due diligence is the new poster boy in the field of business and human rights. But it seems you find there are so many limitations in this concept of human rights due diligence or the climate due diligence as well. Why do you find those limitations problematic? And what is your alternative that you're proposing? So you have the floor now. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those questions. And I think one of the most difficult things I found in writing this piece was to develop this critique and formulate it very carefully so that it doesn't undermine the really important work being done by writers, advocates, and policymakers to make business consider the human rights impact of climate change, but rather to expand and deepen that work through an engagement of a critical perspective. And I think the growing consensus around the need for an integrated approach that addresses both environmental and human rights impact is a really welcome development in the field of business and human rights. And I certainly see climate change as a human rights issue. It's now widely recognised that climate change will have a cataclysmic impact on the realisation of almost all human rights. My concern is, however, that given the scale and the scope of the climate crisis and the drastically worsening impacts, that even as climate due diligence is increasingly taking shape as a dimension of human rights due diligence, there's growing evidence of the limitations of this emerging norm to really confront the root causes of the climate crisis or to provide accountability and redress for the corporate actions that have contributed to the climate crisis. In my conclusion, I quote Philip Olson's scathing assessment of the response by human rights bodies to climate change, which he describes as, and I quote, patently inadequate and premised on forms of incremental managerialism and proceduralism that are entirely disproportionate to the urgency and magnitude of the threat. And I sort of see climate due diligence as sort of following this pattern, that while it's a welcome incremental improvement, it's also entirely inadequate to the really dire situation that we find ourselves in. So drawing on Surya's important recent critiques of mandatory human rights due diligence in the Leiden Journal of International Law, I advanced 4 different critiques of the emerging concept of climate due diligence. Firstly, I look at the insufficiency of climate due diligence to ensure corporate respect for human rights in the context of climate change. And in that section, I draw on recent climate litigation to show how such litigation is affirming the normal climate due diligence, but actually going beyond it already in some of those outcomes. Secondly, I look at the conceptual ambiguity regarding what the standard of conduct that climate due diligence imposes, and particularly the way in which corporate net zero pledges risk muddying the water here. I thirdly look at operational limitations in conducting climate due diligence due to the spatially and temporally dispersed nature of climate-related human rights impacts. And then finally, I look at the structural limitations of climate due diligence, given the political and economic powers of the corporate actors that are overwhelmingly responsible for climate-related human rights impacts, namely the fossil fuel industry. And so my primary concern is that even though we know that 86% of global carbon emissions come from the burning of coal, oil, and gas, the UNGP framework does not ask fundamental questions about the compatibility of continuing fossil fuel development and the realisation of human rights. Moreover, I think the framework of the UNGP fails to grapple with the massive political and economic power that's been exercised by carbon majors and how they've really promoted misinformation and influenced policy to undermine climate policy and protect their interests for the last 50 years. So whilst the 4 critiques I make might suggest quite different policy responses, I suggest that all 4 of these critiques can be answered by drawing clear regulatory red lines to constrain or prevent business activities that are incompatible for rights-based just transition to a low-carbon society. And I suggest 2 such red lines. Firstly, regulatory reforms to prevent or prohibit any new fossil fuel projects or the extension of any existing fossil fuel projects. And secondly, regulatory reforms to prevent and address the harmful corporate capture of regulatory institutions by fossil fuel interests. Then in the last part of the essay, I look what measures might be necessary to ensure effective access to a remedy, for the existing and potential future climate-related human rights impacts that businesses have caused or contributed to. And I highlight there the need for reparations and remedy measures to address 2 different types of harms. Firstly, the misleading and deceptive conduct of fossil fuel companies, and secondly, the loss and damage related to the adverse impacts of climate change. And in my conclusion, I express my fervent hope that in the face of the enormous policy challenges that climate crisis confronts us with, that business and human rights practitioners, advocates, and scholars would not be content with applying constrained regulatory tools to this super wicked problem, but rather use this as an imperative to pursue bold and ambitious action to address the climate crisis, and in doing so, also re-envision the possibilities for corporate human rights accountability. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia, for highlighting those critical elements of HRDD, your critique of climate due diligence as well. And although David did not use this term red lines, it seems he was hinting towards it when he was talking about the tobacco industry, the whitening cream and all that. So he was saying that probably the impact assessment is not going to capture all those particular issues. We already have a question for you, David, so we'll come back to that. So please post more questions there. But now, Barnali, I would like to turn to you. As you mentioned in your introduction, you approach business and human rights landscape from corporate law perspective, from investment law perspective. And I think that adds this unique value. And in your paper, you consider that these mandatory human rights due diligence legislation, these could be more like a window dressing. This is the precise term that you use. Why do you think this could be window dressing on the part of states, or probably even on the part of companies who are doing this due diligence in practice? And you also ask a very pinpointed conclusion you raise, that corporate law facilitates corporate human rights abuses. That's a very powerful claim. So what needs to change in corporate law so that we can have a better world going forward? You have the floor, Barnali.
So thanks very much. I guess in answer to your first question as to whether or not I think that these HRDD initiatives are window dressing, I just want to be candid that the words that I actually wanted to write were that they were lipstick on a pig, but my research assistant wouldn't let me do that. And what I really think is going on here is that these kinds of initiatives are sort of performative in nature. And from a corporate law perspective, really these kinds of initiatives are great. I'm not that much of a critic. I think it's a good step forward, but I think that they really don't address the root causes of corporate abuse, which, as you mentioned, I think is really facilitated by corporate law. So really, if we want to change corporate behavior, then I think we actually need to change corporate law. And that's something that, for the most part, these HRDD initiatives really don't do. So let's talk about what's wrong with corporate law. Okay, so let's talk about how first businesses operate. So generally, the corporate model for operating is focusing on generating wealth while simultaneously cutting costs, and then you get the grand prize of maximizing corporate wealth. And the route that's taken towards obtaining this prize is usually peppered with efforts to minimize corporate risk and liability, all the while ignoring and discounting any impacts of corporate activities, particularly on human rights issues. And the impetus for this model seems to be this idea of financialization. So that is the use of financial motives and financials as the central tenet of the economy. And from a legal perspective, this is often translated into corporations maximizing shareholder wealth and giving primacy to shareholder interests. But this idea of prioritizing the financial interests of shareholders is actually not limited to the law. Rather, it seems to be a bit of a social norm. So it doesn't matter whether you're in Taiwan or Timbuktu or Toronto, prioritizing shareholders' financial interests appears to be what society expects corporations to do. And corporate law draws upon that idea, and it also bestows two benefits on corporations. So first is this idea of separate legal personality, or the idea that every corporation is separate from all the other corporations, including ones that they control, such as a subsidiary. And second, it results in limited liability, or the idea that shareholders are only responsible for their investments in the corporation. And together, these two concepts mean that if a corporation owns shares in a subsidiary, say worth $1 million, and that subsidiary causes environmental harm, let's say of $10 million, then the corporation will not be responsible for the $10 million in damages that it causes. Rather, it's just going to lose the $1 million investment in its subsidiary. And this is true even if the corporation has instructed the subsidiary to cause that $10 million in environmental harm. So what that means then is that corporate law seems to be enabling the corporation to focus on generating wealth while externalizing its costs in generating that wealth and limiting its risk. And this lets the corporation focus on its business operations, even if in doing so, it tends to infringe on people's rights or environmental rights, and without it being held accountable for any type of infringement. So how do we fix this? I've got a couple of ideas. So first, let's work on changing the social norm that corporations are designed only to focus on the financial interests of the firm. That can be through education, both of future and current business leaders, but it can also work via the law by stipulating that the purpose of the corporation is for more than just the interests of shareholders. And these types of purpose clauses, though, are going to do little on its own, but they can at least signal a wider direction for corporate leaders. A second thing we can do could be, and that could also be coupled with this idea of a broader corporate purpose, and that would be to specify new fiduciary duties for directors. So a director's fiduciary duty defines the standard of conduct that's expected of a director in taking a particular course of action. So if we define a fiduciary duty in a specific way, then that can be important to delineating the manner in which that director is going to pursue a particular course of corporate action. So one option could be to introduce a fiduciary duty for directors to be duly diligent in preventing human rights and environmental harms. And that kind of duty would trigger an obligation on directors to institute proper mechanisms to identify, prevent, and mitigate such harms, and then they would be liable under corporate law for failing to institute such mechanisms. And this type of duty would bring human rights and environmental issues into the corporate decision-making sphere, and this could also lead on to knock-on corporate governance effects, which would further prevent this type of harm. A third possibility is to try and reduce the influence of shareholders in the governance of corporations. Now, corporations, after all, involve contributions by a broad range of stakeholders, not just shareholders, and yet shareholders are the only ones that are involved in the governance of corporations. So to that end, we could have corporations allow more than just shareholders to elect the board of directors. We could appoint independent directors who would act as a representative for a stakeholder group, or we could set up an advisory council or an ad hoc panel of stakeholder representatives, and they would be in charge of advocating for stakeholder interests directly to the board. And finally, we could allow for more than just shareholders to enforce directors' duties. So in some jurisdictions, this is already possible for non-stakeholders to bring a derivative action to enforce a director's duty. In others, there are state agencies or public bodies that have been entrusted with enforcing these duties. And if directors know that a public body or a stakeholder can hold them accountable, then it is possible that they are going to be much more likely to consider more than just the shareholder interest in taking a particular corporate action. And that, in my opinion, could be a bigger win for human rights protection, more so than just HRDD.
Thank you, Banali. So it seems you are articulating for a new corporate law regime, because it seems your critique is that the current corporate law is promoting this new liberal economic order, which David is also critical about. Julia hinted its limitations and all that. So I think there are some of those common points, and hopefully we'll be able to address that during the discussion. Juan Pablo, I would like to now move on to you. And in your paper, it seems you take a different direction. Different direction in a sense that instead of critiquing the limitations of human rights due diligence, you would like to extend human rights due diligence to those areas where it is not typically seen. Let us say talking about debt restructuring, and you take 2 case studies of Argentina as an example. So can you try to unpack your key arguments that why you're optimistic that the human rights due diligence or impact assessment of debt restructuring or corporate creditors, those issues are going to change how they behave for now, including international financial institutions for that matter? You have the floor, Juan Pablo. Thank you.
Good morning, good evening for you. Can you hear me well? Great. First, Surya, I want to congratulate the editors of this special edition for creating this space for further problematizing and collectively thinking on the notion of human rights due diligence in the business field. So yeah, the article studies human rights due diligence by private corporate creditors in the context of sovereign debt restructuring. So first, it is a paper, an article written with 2 economists, Francisco Cantamuto and Lucas Castiglione. And first, we ask whether private corporate creditors hold human rights due diligence obligations in the context of debt restructuring. And the answer that we provide is yes. Private lenders are bound by international human rights law as the rest of the corporations in the world. So when dealing with sovereign borrowers, these creditors should follow the human rights due diligence standards, which have been crystallized and systematized in official documents of UN bodies and agencies to ensure that at the very least they don't harm debtor populations. And more specifically, this means that when dealing with states in debt distress and having to take financial decisions that will have a profound fiscal implications for these populations, lenders should undertake due diligence in order to determine and agree a haircut, that means a debt relief, that is sensitive to the socioeconomic situation of the country in question. So the size of the haircut applied must meet fiscal needs of the social and economic human rights. The second question, so we go on the argument, and then the article analyzes whether haircuts applied by creditors across countries effectively and regularly consider the social and economic human rights situation of debtor countries as part of the creditors' due diligence. So the specific question here was, have private creditors regularly taken into consideration the socioeconomic and human rights situation of the debtor countries in order to agree the size of the debt relief in debt restructuring? The answer is no. Here we provide empirical statistical evidence. We took a historical series of sovereign debt restructuring that took place between 2007 and 2020. And this aggregated evidence shows that social variables intrinsically linked to economic and social human rights have not been regularly considered when negotiating and deciding on haircuts for borrowing countries in debt distress. More specifically, the debt weight of the economies of countries in general, the volume of government expenditures on health and education, and the more specific indicators reflecting the economic and social human rights situations, such as unemployment rate, have not been relevant variables in determining the haircut size in the countries in distress. In other words, the haircuts agreed by creditors are not regularly sensitive to the social and economic human rights situation of debtor populations. And third, the third argument I'm finding at the same time was the question that we posed was where in the Argentina's latest debt restructuring human rights taken into account when agreeing on the size of the haircut? The answer is no. Here we took the specific case of Argentina's 2005 and 2020 debt restructurings, and we found the same phenomenon. The social and human rights situation of the debtor countries has not been considered when agreeing debt restructuring in these past years. So finally, you asked, Surya, whether I'm optimistic about the value of human rights due diligence in this specific context of debt restructurings. To some extent, yes, I am. And let me very briefly explain why. Finance is probably, in my view, the least developed field in terms of the concrete importance of human rights in business. In this sector, we are still discussing the obvious, such as whether financial activities can be or not causally linked to activities that harm human rights. So human rights due diligence, by offering a sophisticated set of questions that private lenders should ask and answer themselves before taking decisions that will impact on state revenues, may have two positive consequences. One, exposing to the public opinion the potential causal effects of debt agreement on the realization of economic and social rights of the sovereign debtors' populations. And second, human rights due diligence might politically and legally strengthen arguments on why states should not fully repay their debts when this entails draining fiscal resources to the point that minimum core of economic, social, and cultural rights cannot be guaranteed in the debtor countries. Thank you, Surya.
Thank you. Thank you, and Pablo, for articulating it so precisely, because then I will invite participants to read his paper to fully understand the argument. So now, Mariana, thank you for waiting so patiently for your turn. And there are already some questions, so thank you for that as well, for posting questions. And David, I'm going to come back to you with those questions. Because there are two questions for you, one posted by Brent and second by Olena. So I'm going to pose those questions combined. So if you can reflect in the meantime, Mariana will have the chance to talk about her paper. So Mariana, you talk about in your paper that the rights-based economy, the concept, that human rights due diligence may not really be able to contribute or create a rights-based economy. Why do we need a rights-based economy? And I think there's a nice connection between what you are saying and what you and Pablo articulated, because he's talking about the private creditors and debt restructuring. And I believe those will be the elements of rights-based economy, because those are the aspects of economy, financing and all that. So you're calling for some transformative shifts in business models. So you have the floor to share with us what needs to change beyond HRDD. Thank you.
Thank you, Surya, again for the invitation, and thank you for the editors for putting together such a cohesive journal. I must say I really enjoyed reading it. So I really do recommend those that haven't to read the other articles, including the one that I'll briefly mention today. I think I would break down your question, Surya, into 5 points. The first one is building on the work of feminist scholars such as Nancy Fraser, Radhika Balakrishna, Diane Elson, which looked at the importance of putting human rights front and center when we're talking about economic policies and economic reforms. That's not the only bit of work that exists. It is an upcoming area of work, and that some of us call a rights-based economy or rights enabling economies. And the idea of an RBE, as some of us call, is for the enabling of the realization of human rights. It is an umbrella term that does not want to crowd out, but rather to understand the plurality of alternative economic models that exist, and to have, let's say, human rights as a threshold for evaluating which policies should be promoted, which policies should be reformed, and which ones aren't adequate. And in a way, it looks at the environment, the context where you operate in. And you're right, Juan Pablo's article really gives really two great examples of how the context can be quite harmful when you're talking about the realization of human rights and the space needed for states to abide by their obligations when it comes to their own populations. So that's point one. Point two is, in a way, also answering your question. Mandatory human rights due diligence or human rights due diligence is incapable of promoting the seismic shifts that we need. Barnelli was already, I wouldn't say, it is a lipstick on a pig, as Barnelli was saying, but I am skeptical of its capacity to be the magic bullet. I think some of the elements that Juan Pablo brought in terms of how it can promote, for example, very compelling arguments for states to default, it's a very good example, and there are many others of how mandatory human rights vigilance might be useful, but it's only a tool. It's only a tool in a very wide toolbox that, for me, needs to look at the macro, meso, and micro level. So what are the levels that we're looking at? And when we're looking at more of a macro level, how can we therefore really fundamentally challenge neoliberalism, as David was mentioning in his intervention just now and in his paper as well, to prevent the very toxic and exploitative harms that are inherent in neoliberalism. And I just want to really flesh that out, because it's not like what I propose in my piece is not a quick fix to neoliberalism. And in a way, I also challenge and contend Ruggi's arguments on embedded liberalism. I find that, at least when we're coming to what we have seen over the past decades, I do think we are in a place where we can fundamentally transform neoliberalism, and that's the role of the RBE. Point three, really quickly, when you look at the role of markets, they aren't, and this has been said, so I won't be too repetitive, they aren't built as part of the neoliberal footprint for the promotion of human rights. They are promoted for profit. They are promoted, they are built so they enhance shareholder value. And this is, for me, a fundamental problem with what we have in terms of the neoliberal policy making and the neoliberal tools that we have. You have to understand that the UNGPs are inserted into that fabric, and that mandatory human rights due diligence is inserted into that fabric. And in a way, any tool that is used will replicate the distortions of that system. Therefore, we need to look at system level change while also trying to, let's say, improve the existing tools that we have available to us. On the fourth point, I think it is important that instead of trying to fix, as I said, neoliberalism, is to have human rights as guiding threads. What has been said is true, that when we're looking at financial systems or more of economic reforms or other policies that we might analyze, we don't have human rights as an intrinsic value, and sometimes we don't even have the analysis of human rights front and center. We have seen in the past few decades even the instrumentalization of the human rights discourses and language, which has, in a way, watered down some of the instruments, the implementation of some of the international instruments that we have available. What I'm calling for in the article is for that to be critically analyzed and fundamentally changed. And lastly, and pretty quickly, in short, it's important for us to remember, and this has been also mentioned in other articles, that the importance of using the human rights principles when we are looking at some of the macro, meso, micro elements. And one of the things that I'm mentioning in my article is the importance of macroeconomic policies. When you are trying to correct some of the distortions and some of the distortions that some of the tools like mandatory human rights due diligence or human rights due diligence replicate, they aren't going to be capable of correcting those distortions unless we look at the macro level and really do embed human rights principles and norms within the system that we are operating in. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mariana. And you articulate this idea of human rights-based economy, and the Office of the High Commissioner, as well as the current High Commissioner, is articulating as well the human rights economy idea. And I think we can also make a connection with the Secretary General's call for the Summit of the Future and the transformative changes that he is articulating, whether it's tax regime or international economic order or the financial system and all that. So I think the conversations I think should be seen in that particular context that we are having today. So David, if I could pick a couple of questions that are specifically directed towards your intervention. So Olena, for instance, is asking that can we consider that certain harms, injustices, inequality is kind of given in a neoliberal economic order, and we have to accept it. And I think Mariana also kind of hinting that this is built in, the toxic, the market is linked to that. So do you think we have to accept it as a side effect of the neoliberal order, or can we transform the neoliberal order? And that could happen if we articulate or re-articulate or reimagine the corporate responsibilities in a much broad sense, more ambitious sense. That is one question. And Brent also posed a question to you, which is more like probably an idea for your argumentation that should businesses also have a duty to protect human rights, and why they should have, because under the investment law, they have those rights under state investor dispute resolution. So if you want to comment on that. And after that, I'm going to come to Bernali and Julia. So if you can look at the questions that are specifically posed towards you. So I'm going to come to both of you. Thank you. So David, you can respond to these questions now. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So in terms of Olena's question and the way that you framed it as well, Surya, I think the answer is not either or. I think the answer is both at once. I sort of interpret this question in a way, should we work within neoliberalism, or should we just kind of, completely reject that because of all the problems? And again, just to reiterate, I think the answer is both. I think that the idea of human, let me be clear about this because I only had a limited amount of time to speak at the beginning. I do say in the paper very clearly that I think that the human rights due diligence is an improvement overall on what came before. What was it that came before? The idea that doing nothing, that a business remaining ignorant of its own causal and operational connections was an excuse. And what the UNGPs do is they say that's not an excuse. Not knowing, doing nothing is not an excuse. Businesses need to go out of their way to take positive action, to investigate the forms of harm that they might be causing, to look at what they're causing and contributing to and connected with in terms of human rights impacts. So it's an improvement. It's the ethics of disembedded liberalism. It is and it's in a particularly enlightened form of that ethics. But I think it's not enough. And I think in the shorter term, working within the neoliberal world order, I think what can be done in a practical way is to reorient Pillar 2 around equality rather than only around the idea of harm. Mariana's paper talks about a rights-based economy, and it was a very interesting paper. One of the questions that I try to go deeper on is, what does it mean to be rights-based? And I say that equality is the value that gives human rights their normative force. What it means to be rights-based shouldn't mean that states are the only actors that are ultimately responsible for what happens to their domestic populations, because they're the only ones with the duties, and other actors' responsibilities are limited to not causing harm. Because they're not the ones with the rights-based duties, they have different responsibilities. I'm trying to reorient this, and I think that reorienting that second pillar around businesses operationalizing a commitment to equality by identifying, reducing, and working to eliminate structural inequalities with which they're connected. That's a very practical way forward that can be done within the current world order. However, I think in the longer term, and in addition to that, we need to reconsider the fundamentals of the institutional order that demarcates public and private actors in a way that both enables and hides human rights violations. So there's two parts of my argument. One is this more immediate thing that we can do to reorient Pillar 2 around equality. The second point is the more fundamental critique that we need to add the missing fourth pillar and reconsider, try to challenge and change the world order. On to Brent's question. Brent's question, and I'll just go back to the question, was that corporations have an international public quality seen in their unique rights and in investor-state relations, and shouldn't this mean, what are the implications of this in terms of whether they have human rights duties? So this is something that I talk about quite a lot in my 2014 book, Responsibility for Human Rights, the idea that corporations are public enough in some ways to have the human rights duties that we think of as falling uniquely on states. And Florian Wetstein as well, in his book, talks about the corporations as quasi-public or state-like institutions. One of the things that I'm doing differently in this paper in Business and Human Rights Journal is that 10 years later, 10 years after I wrote that book, I'm actually becoming more critical of the public-private distinction itself. I'm tying it more in a way that I hadn't done before to the institutional order and institutional context in which it makes sense, rather than simply treating it as an analytical or a normative device. What is the public-private distinction doing right now? It says there are some private actors who can be free to do whatever they want, subject to doing no harm, and other public actors who can have much more extensive and demanding duties, because those public actors are essentially seen as service providers for the private ones. And in the paper, I challenge this in a number of ways, one of which is to look at feminism, to look at feminist analysis, and to look at feminists have argued that constituting an actor or a space as private, as an area where an agent can be free to do whatever they want, to value whatever they want, where the state can't interfere, and the public space is qualitatively different from that. Feminists have been saying for decades that this just serves to make harm invisible. It serves to justify the public not looking into so-called private spaces. So I'm trying to provide a more critical intervention into the public-private distinction itself, instead of just asking in what ways are corporations public and in which ways are corporations private, which was the way that the question, Brent's question, was framed.
Thank you, David. Thank you for very comprehensive responses. Barnali, if I may turn to you, and one of the questions specifically posed by Matthew is to you. What do you feel about this proposal that the director's duties should include those elements of sustainability and long-termism and all that? Do you think that could be a game changer, or if that becomes part of the mandatory human rights due diligence? And probably I could throw in the question from Brent as well, the role of criminal law. I don't know if you want to comment on that, but definitely these are two questions I want to pose to you. Thank you.
So thank you, Surya. I'm actually going to answer the question first from Firat, if that's okay, because I'm not sure, you didn't write anybody's name in there, but something tells me that that one was for me. And it's something that relates to the later question as well. So Firat asks where the first comment that he made was, we know that companies have to prioritize their economic interests. And I want to challenge that. I don't think that we need to I don't think we know that companies have to prioritize their economic interests. I think we are moving towards this idea that we need to have companies focus on sustainability or the sustainable impacts of their corporation, which includes, of course, financial or economic interests, but it's not exclusive to economic or financial interests. And I think in that sense, I can answer Matthew's question here, which is that obviously I think incorporating sustainability factors into directors' duties would be, I don't know if it's a game changer, but it definitely would work towards, at least from a corporate law perspective, making corporate law less of a threat to human rights kinds of issues. So I think, you know, the earlier version of the EU's model in this area, Articles 25 and 26, which we just talked about in class yesterday, actually, would have been a really important change, but unfortunately those were both rejected. But I think we should be working towards this idea of having fiduciary duties of directors incorporate a greater, I guess, understanding of sustainability factors. In terms of criminal law, I have to say I know less about criminal law in this area. I do know that there is an increasing amount of work that's being done in this area about introducing corporate criminal liability. However, I have, I guess, less faith in this area than I do for from an HRDD perspective, because HRDD is really run from a legal perspective as tort law, which means that there will be a lower burden of proof. And obviously for criminal law, things require a higher degree of proof or a higher burden of proof. And so therefore it would be more difficult under criminal law.
Thank you, Banali, for being succinct as well. So Julia, if I may turn to you now. And I think this is another question from Brent. And the question is that, will you consider corporate dishonesty in itself a harm, a breach of human rights, independent of what results because of that dishonesty, you know? So, and I think that is the question, I believe, in the context of climate change and what companies are doing in terms of greenwashing, all that. So how would you respond to that question? And then I would like to come back to you, Juan Pablo. There's a question about WTO and not WTO, World Bank and all that. So probably I will throw that towards you. The question is from Howard. Juan Pablo, so if you can prepare your response to that question. But Julia, you can go first now. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So I wanted to sort of firstly say, I think under a lot of domestic law, corporate misinformation is treated as a very serious matter under consumer protection laws. False and misleading statements can be prosecuted by regulators. Similarly, false statements to financial markets are very heavily policed and regulated as a necessary part of neoliberal capitalism. And so I don't think this is anything new to expect corporations to not engage in misleading conduct, but yet somehow the decades of deception, willful deception that is being increasingly uncovered, that the fossil fuel companies have engaged in climate change isn't treated with the same sort of seriousness. In my piece, I do canvass the growing climate litigation that is making specific arguments around this as basis either under consumer protection or tort law generally. For example, there's like a case that was filed in late 2022 by 16 municipalities in Puerto Rico against a number of fossil fuel companies, including ExxonMobil, Shell, Chevron, under US racketeering and antitrust laws. But there's a number of litigation underfoot making these types of arguments, and it'll be a really interesting thing to see how that develops. In terms of human rights, I think I hadn't really considered whether misleading conduct is a human rights violation per se, but clearly in the case of climate misinformation, the fact that this misinformation was used deliberately to avoid policy mechanisms that would limit the harm of the activities that these companies are doing has meant that the harm has increased and was allowed to continue, and therefore has meant the human rights violations have infinitely expanded. So we can draw a direct causal chain between the misinformation and the exacerbation of the really extreme human rights violations that we're seeing coming from climate change. And just to jump in on that, on that previous question too about directors' duties, I mentioned that briefly as part of the concerns about the ambiguity that I think what we're seeing now is directors increasingly through climate litigation and things too, being under a duty to consider the climate risks to the company. And I highlight in my analysis too that there's a real difference between analysing what are the risks of climate change or a transition to a low carbon economy to the company and what are the climate related human rights harms being caused by the company. And I worry that in some of the risk analysis done by companies, there might be a confusion or a conflation between them, or a prioritization of an analysis of the risks to the company rather than analysis of the risks of what the company is causing to society, the environment, and to other rights stakeholders.
Thank you, Julia. And I would just like to add a footnote that if we consider right to information as a human right, then probably the corporate dishonesty in terms of what information they share, what information they hide, that could potentially be regarded as impacting right to information as a human right, I believe. Okay, so you and Pablo, though this question was not specifically directed towards you, I felt that the question about the role of World Bank, those international financial institutions, because they are the key players also in terms of debt restructuring, the economic policies that the states are taking. So what is your take on that? And also your previous mandate, UN experience, how difficult, how easy it is to push the idea of human rights due diligence or the human rights language to these international institutions?
Yeah, this is this is a very interesting questions. I have two comments. Well, for those who are not familiar with the news, commented on this question. The World Bank announced a couple of weeks ago that it will freeze new loans to Uganda because of the country's discriminatory anti-LGTB law. So this is in principle a very interesting development, as not only shows that the human rights might be, the World Bank might be open to consider human rights in its decision, but also to use them selectively, as economic and social rights don't seem to deserve a similar amount of energy from the World Bank, and even less from the IMF. So to answer to this specific question, yes, human rights due diligence should be comprehensive, covering all human rights, including environmental rights, so that due diligence is not just a performative tool to pretend that human rights are relevant for the lending institution, but in reality only advances a rather selective political agenda.
Thank you for that. Okay, there's some interesting questions, and I'm going to throw those questions now. Bernali, perhaps, or anyone else could also respond to this question. That question is from Seklin Chung. That question is, can we see the value of HRDD in terms of shaping corporate culture? And I think corporate law also plays some role, at least Bernali, in creating and shaping corporate culture. So do you see the value of HRDD in that particular sense? And there's also a question posted by Mary to all the panelists, and I would like to open the floor, and probably anyone or all of you can briefly respond to that question by Mary, that how do we monetize? And I think if I'm reframing this question correctly, Mary, she is hinting about the cost benefit, the cost of complying with human rights and the cost of violating human rights. So businesses are looking at that. What is better for them in terms of making money? Can they respect human rights, or should they ignore human rights and pay a tiny bit of a fine and carry on doing those kind of things? So if anyone would like to respond to that generic question or the more deep-rooted question, but before we do that, let us say, Barnali, if you can highlight a little bit your thoughts about corporate culture and HR daily. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. So I agree that there can be obviously good impacts on corporate culture by the whole idea of this type of regulation is that if there's a reflexive element to it, that the corporation will internalize this need to engage in due diligence, and therefore the internal corporate governance policies will be better reflected to take into account those kinds of issues. But I actually want to make a plug here. I think it depends on the type of HRDD legislation as well. So not all HRDD legislation will give these positive impacts. And to that end, you should read Surya Deva's article, which in a very good, eloquent way talks about sort of the deficiencies with the different types of HRDD legislation that's out there. And I think that would that'll also give you some sort of answers as to whether or not certain types, or whether there are some types of legislation that are better than others in trying to promulgate better corporate culture.
Thank you for that. Mariana, I see your hand. So you could respond to this question or any question for that matter. You have the floor. Thank you.
Sure, I'll add to that question, and also there was one from Santiago I'd like to respond to. On that point, I would recommend another article, joint article by Quijano on mandatory human rights due diligence that touches upon what Barnali was just saying. So of course, beyond Surya's piece, which I also recommend, they are very good at looking at what does it mean from an accountability point of view, and what are the do's and don'ts, and why we should be critical but not complete disregard. At least that's certainly my opinion. And one point here is that I think we tend to mention corporates as if they are this really big homogeneous block, but they aren't, and we all know that here. It's a very heterogeneous group, and therefore there are good practices within corporates. I recall I used to work for an organization called Christian Aid based in the UK, and they have this network called the SALT Network, which is focusing on an ethical approach to business models. It is more of a medium-sized, small-sized corporates, but still, I think that does permeate what our social perceptions around the issues are, and therefore do have a role in impacting change. And the other point that Santiago was mentioning, was asking, was about the lens of capitalism and the legacy of colonialism. And in response to Santiago, I would say that in my view, we have three structural issues that are reinforcing each other. And for me, those are neoliberalism. We've been talking about that quite extensively today. Neocolonialism and patriarchy. Hence why I really do rely a lot on feminist scholars, some of the work that I do. For me, the RBE would look at the macro level from the critical point of view of the interaction of those three structures, and therefore try to see how human rights can be front and center to more of a transformative and people-centered economic models. That would not happen without economic reforms, I'm afraid. It would be incremental. I don't think we would completely replace neoliberalism at once. I think it would be, a set of steps forward and many backwards, but I do think it is possible if we are conscious and able to challenge neoliberal myths, such as why we should always put the primacy of profit over people. Why is that the case? Why can't we challenge some of the neoliberal myths and do think of how to put people and look at, for example, some of the theory of that Bruno Latour brings into how to embed the social when we're talking about the market. But there is some discussion of how there was this whole this whole construction that the market should be completely left at its own devices, and therefore we should trust the market's power to self-regulate. But then there are authors like Bruno Latour and others that are saying, no, we should really re-embed the social when we're talking about the power of markets and the role that they should play in regular life.
Thank you, Mariana. And I think I also want to bring in a question that Bruno has posted here, and Bruno is asking what more is needed. And the example that Bruno is speaking is the tech industry context. So the Bruno sees some hope in the idea of mandatory human rights due diligence because self-regulation was not working. So at least mandatory HRDD is going to bring some change. But what else could be done? As Bruno asked, the specialist is asking what else is needed, right? So if not human rights due diligence, what else is needed? And I would like to pose that question to all of you, all the panelists. And I think that would also be an opportunity for you to reflect or react to each other's interventions. Anything else you want to add to this discussion and debate that we're having? Try to be brief, maybe maximum 1 or 2 minutes each. Who would like to start first? Respond to Bruno's question or react to anyone else? Julia, I see your hand, sir. So why don't we start with Julia first?
Great, I'm happy to jump in. In my conclusion, I go back to like in the 1970s, which was a period when we're first starting to hear about climate change, when we have neoliberalism starting to emerge, and also a period in which third world states are really contesting the neocolonialism of the international economic order through proposals for a new international economic order. There was a massive focus on the role of corporations and the need to regulate corporations. But those debates then broke down because about whether the Treaty on Corporations should address corporate responsibilities or corporate rights. And then what we've seen since then is the expansion of a massive sphere of investor-state dispute resolution, international investment law that's protected corporate rights. And then we've had a more voluntarist framework that's trying to promote corporate responsibility and corporate duties. And so I think we do really need to do a massive realignment of the regulatory structure and to take away the way in which corporations have been given so much power to sue governments, to dictate the terms of policy. And I think that really ties in with, contesting the neocolonialism, the neoliberalism of the international economic order. So do not just think about, okay, how do we address these regulatory gaps, but how is international law complicit in creating these gaps by giving massive amounts of power to corporations to really impose their agenda of governance, of policy on states, and to the detriment of the realization of rights, environmental sustainability, social justice, equality, equity, and all these things that we care about. So I find it really helpful to go back to those sort of those questions about the alignment that needs to happen.
Thank you for that, Julia. And I also like to acknowledge a general comment by Brian that how HRDD could add a value. It's a good starting point, and a reference is made to corporate law. In fact, Bernali, as you may have seen in the general comment, that it might be encouraging those companies to take Section 170 duties more seriously. It may promote gender equality and all that. So just want to acknowledge that comment. But going back to the other panelists, if you want to respond to that general question of Bruno, or you want to respond to a question that has just come from Nicholas about Myanmar, maybe David, you may wish to jump into that question, because when we talk about Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, and one thing that I've always struggled with this division of Pillar 1 and 2 is this, that what if a state is missing? What if Pillar 2 is missing? There is no state, or a state is consciously and intentionally promoting human rights abuses. What do you do in those particular situations? So maybe you could reflect on that, because that goes back to the fundamental divide that you're trying to critique. Anyone else can also jump in, but I will give the floor to David first. Thank you.
So like this, and this follows on really nicely from what Julia was just saying about the new international economic order agenda from the 1970s. I'm doing a more historical research project now with Daniel Edquist Whalen, and one of the things that we're looking at is what's happening in the human rights politics of the 1980s. And what's happening is you're getting the initial emergence of this state-based human rights obligations framework, which says that countries like Myanmar are responsible for human rights issues inside of their borders, and that's the main mode in which the international human rights system is going to work. I don't have time to go into any detail on that, but that idea starts off from becoming a radical proposal to deal with practical obstacles to realizing the right to foods, to becoming a kind of a hegemonic idea about what human rights means by the 2000s. And that goes alongside, well, one thing that happens is, to get to the point, is that discussion about human rights working through states and being about states' obligations and responsibilizing states for what happens sort of splits from the discussion of the right to development, which is where a lot of the ideas that spark the NIEO agenda end up sort of going into. So one of the things that not just in this Business and Human Rights Journal paper, but in my broader research agenda that I'm interested in and trying to work on is how do you reconnect these two things? How do you kind of reconnect the statism about human rights and the international dimension of responsibility, which looks at colonialism and international hierarchy and the responsibilities of all the world's political authorities to all of the world's peoples. So I guess to link that back to the question, I'm not entirely, and this relates to something Mariana was saying, I'm not entirely happy with just making this Myanmar's responsibility and saying it's all on Myanmar. I think there needs to be more discussion about the history and the context that led to this. And as I said earlier in the paper, just because I'm aware this is probably the last chance I'll get to kind of wrap things up. I think I'm calling this the missing fourth pillar of the UNGPs, the collective and political responsibility to challenge and change the international world order. And I think that needs to go alongside a much more practical and shorter to medium term commitment of reorienting pillar 2 around the idea of equality and inequality, not just around the idea of harm being caused by private actors.
That's a very good way to sum it up, David, in terms of the collective responsibility, and it feels quite relevant to even my new mandate in terms of duty to cooperate in relation to right to development, for instance, that the actors have to cooperate and come together to overcome the challenges. Mariana, I see your hand, and I will come to you. But before that, there's a question from Christopher, and the question is, what are business schools and law schools doing in terms of training the business leaders, the future business leaders, in terms of the education that we're doing? And probably others can jump in, but as part of one of the co-directors of the Teaching BHR Forum, I can say, Christopher, that I think the momentum is definitely building slowly, that more and more law schools are teaching business and human rights as an elective course, or it is integrated into core courses. But I would say, at least that is my experience, the business schools have a little bit more hesitation in taking core human rights courses as part of the curricula. And though there is a change as well, and it varies from university to university and region to region, but I think definitely much more needs to be done because that's where we could shape the mindset of these leaders. Mariana, you have the floor now. Thank you.
Thank you. And great point on education. I do think that, you know, education has a big role, not only in terms of the capacity building on strengthening when you're talking about, people working within corporates, but also looking at the curricula of not only business schools, economics, administration. And there's actually a very good center within the economics school of University of Campinas, which looks particularly at the human rights economy, which I highly recommend, and is led by Pedro Rossi, one of the contributors of the co-edited book I mentioned at the start of the call. But I actually wanted to wrap up by answering the question about tech, the role of tech. I think for me, that is just one big example of how when we are talking about the role of due diligence and this wider spectrum in terms of a toolbox we might need to ensure that it doesn't replicate distortions, and it's coupled with other initiatives at macro, meso, and micro level. For me, it's really an understanding that this is about power imbalances. When we're talking about colonialism, patriarchy, and neoliberalism, it is about power imbalances. It's about how can we, again, correct those shifts that we have seen historically, and how can we be more positive in terms of and purposeful and intentional about shifting power. And we have I recall that not too long ago one person said, in my work, that you're not going to get a shift from power without taking power from others, and that is very much true. So you're going to experience backlashes. You're going to see this plethora of myths being replicated and replicated. That's what we see. And now I think our role, and what I would invite everyone, each one of you, is to really keep on this critical discussion on what we can potentially do to fundamentally challenge those power imbalances. And the issue what we see is with tech is that there was a very intentional choice, and it's a good example because tech weren't regulated because there was an intentional choice to foment that industry. But now we're saying they're just so big and so powerful that it becomes completely hard to regulate them. We had an interesting case in Brazil a few months back around June when we had Google completely dominating, and you can see all of us use Google possibly on a daily basis, dominating the Brazil networks, to push against a piece of law that was human rights centered, that was trying to put, some barriers and boundaries in terms of the role of big tech firms. And it was paused as a result of that. So that's just one example. But as Surya said, we do have good inklings of hope. We have our common agenda. We have the Office of the High Commissioner pushing for the human rights economy. Bachelet pushed for it. Turk is now completely fully behind this. And we also had the Commission on the Status of Women this year, looking at the role of tech. There were very good recommendations coming out of that space in March, and I fully recommend those that are working within that industry to look at it. But thank you again for this panel and for the invitation again.
Thank you, Mariana. And I'm conscious of the time. I would like to wrap it next 3-4 minutes. So Juan Pablo and Bernali, your last words, and probably Juan Pablo, if you also want to reflect to the last question posed by Krishan. And that question is about the retrospective nature of the human rights obligations and liabilities. Like we're talking about post-colonial context. So should there be the obligation to redress for the past historical wrongs? So if you want to reflect on that, in my view, the answer is yes, but I would give you the floor now. Anything else you want to say? And then Bernali, thank you.
Yeah, well, this is a very interesting question. Let me first add another dimension to the issue of due diligence in the context of debt restructuring, because I want to problematize a bit more and broaden the context for the analysis, which might include also this post-colonial perspective, because it includes international financial institutions. So I want to highlight the role of official creditors, as they can indeed guide debt restructuring processes to meet human rights due diligence, and more specifically, debt sustainability analysis undertaken by the IMF and the World Bank indicate how much debtor states can and should repay, and private investors usually take this evaluation as an important indicator, of course, jointly with those provided with credit rating agencies. So this is an important factor to take decisions regarding the debt portfolio. But criteria used by the IMF and the World Bank to perform debt sustainability analysis have been criticized by scholars and also by civil society organizations as this framework sidelines the human rights implications, including the right to development. So it's connected to the post-colonial discussion. So the IMF and the World Bank fiscal estimations and policy recommendations made to back the debt sustainability evaluations. Moreover, these official creditors have actually been reluctant to provide debt relief to countries facing crisis. So my point is, given this international financial architecture, the role played by the World Bank and the IMF in terms of developing and then undertaking a framework for debt sustainability analysis, my point here is that private creditors cannot take World Bank and IMF criteria as a revealed truth, being responsible private creditor to collect reliable information and make informed decisions to perform their own due diligence.
Thank you so much. Barnali, we're running out of time, but do you have the last word?
Great, I'll be super succinct, okay? So I don't think that we can continue with business as usual. We obviously have to change the model. That's going to require a change in the international economic order, both from a legal perspective as well as, I think, from a political perspective. And HRDD is a starting point, but it cannot be the ending point.
Thank you so much, Barnali. So that brings to the end of this webinar. All the panelists, thank you so much for contributing to the special issue, and thank you for joining this webinar from different time zones. Very much appreciated. So I would like to thank both Cambridge University Press as well as my co-editors and all the authors and all of you listeners for asking questions, posting comments. This webinar has been recorded, so we're going to post it later on. The special issue is going to be made open access very soon, and it will remain open access for the next 1 month. So I will encourage all of you to download these papers and continue the conversation beyond this webinar. Thank you, everyone. Take care. And hopefully the BHRJ will bring more exciting special issues and more webinars like this. Take care. Bye for now. And thank you, Abby, as well.
Many thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye-bye.
Welcome. Bye.